Hello and greetings. Welcome to Mystic Ashram. This is a reading about a formal analysis of poetry, which I did in 2004, of the Sylvia Plath poem, The Mirror. And I really love Sylvia Plath. And so this analysis concerns the wording of Miss Plath in her piece, The Mirror, written in 1961 during the Colossus period. I will look at this piece primarily through examining, deconstructing, and interpreting the root usage of words, metaphors, and analogy. I will also attempt a clinical psychology and autobiographical approach where feasible in deciphering this poet's work. Poetry was perhaps the only mode of expression crystalline enough to express Plath's deepest feelings and thoughts. It is a well-known fact that Plath, during the period prior to Ariel, was fond of using the thesaurus while writing. So I will begin there with Merriam-Webster's. I am silver and exact. Silver conjures steely coolness and is considered a synonym for being glib and vocative. Objectivity as a luxury the author indulges in as opposed to being vulnerable emotionally. The word exact is one of a razor blade cutting indiscriminately through the self and others. Here same is accurate. Nice and proper, in fact rigorous. The author was often torn between being studious or projecting the image of the fun-loving modern woman. I have no preconceptions is translated as having no prejudice or prepossession, as in being open, or also, and I prefer, having no illusion or delusion. The author is refuting her inward reliance upon fantasy to cope with reality. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately. As opposed to the act of physically seeing, the alternate synonym is to fix one's mind or thoughts on. Swallowing can mean to tolerate or stand. Also, it is an allusion to pills, which the author had used in a previous suicide attempt, perhaps as an allusion to growth, a death of the former self in order to birth her own individual artistic style. Just as it is unmisted by love or dislike. The word unmisted takes the foreground here, as it is not accepted by the dictionary, nor is it in the thesaurus. The word mist denotes obscuring and dimming. Here she says that the polar opposite emotions of love and dislike are nothing but blinders for where she is truly going in a metamorphosis of the self. I am not cruel, only truthful. Here the synonym of grim seems to fit best, as the author says she is not macabre nor monstrous. Feelings she must have accused herself of having for dwelling on the serious thoughts that haunted her and that made her difficult for others to be around. Truth can be termed synonymous with realism, referring to her own struggle within against imagery and mythos. It is her statement of being genuine and authentic, as someone who is perceived as being melodramatic by others is inclined towards. The eye of a little god four-cornered. At the time of its invention, the glass mirror was a mystical and surprising device, and was interpreted in Renaissance symbolism to be literally an eye of God. A lowercase God can mean a denunciation of God and simultaneous acceptance of the existence of such. Four-cornered, as in a bed. According to her mother, the author learned of her father's death while she lay in bed in the morning, her response being to roll over, covering herself completely with the blanket, saying, "There is no God," repeatedly, because she had been praying for her father's recovery. Most of the time, I meditate on the opposite wall. Alternates of meditate involve turning over, mulling, and ruminating, of which were commonplace in Miss Plath's life from the time of losing her father onward. The opposite wall proves to be both a hindrance to her insights, also a companion to her in her daily existence. The author often felt that the people closest to her alternately caused great love for them and simultaneously instilled a fear of losing them. Her self-destructive urge was to push away from those closest to her and relinquish relationships before she might suffer their loss. Such relationships were an obstacle to her functioning, just like a physical wall she could not get over or go around. It is pink with speckles, pink being the color of the traditionally feminine, speckles being a flaw in the pinkness. Here we find a flawed sense of femininity and feelings of inadequacy in playing out the roles of a woman. Such roles are contrary to her own inner nature. I have looked at it so long, I think it is a part of my heart. She has looked at these stereotypes imposed on her before her very eyes, and she now believes them to be a part of her innermost being. Still inwardly, she knows they are contrived. But it flickers, as in something alluring that catches the eye, glittering and sparkling, almost beckoning her despite her own knowledge of its fallacy. Faces and darkness separate us over and over. As opposed to the physical term, the word faces can mean being brave in the face of an enemy, especially an illusory one such as the darkness of death. It is an allusion to being fearless enough to join the world of the great beyond. The second stanza retreats from the precipice of bleak yearnings for an early grave and begins a journey back from the destination of the first paragraph. It speaks not from the harsher realism that the author perceives in life, but from her own inner self, which is a world of imagery from which she takes solace. Now I am a lake. Water is always an element aligned with great emotion. It is the polar opposite of beginning of the first paragraph of the poem, in which the author states how devoid of emotion she is. A woman bends over me. Once again, this is the opposing side of the last paragraph, in which she tries to disown her role and societal obligation as a female. Here she acknowledges this clearly. Searching my reaches for what she really is. Having taken everything in and covered the gamut of possibility, the author desires to reinvent herself with the full scope of her newly acquired knowledge. Then she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. In the author's use of language, candles are synonymous with the flickering described above, very pretty and alluring, but in the end only a distraction and nothing of substance. The moon is a reappearing guest in Miss Plath's poems, and in fact, the first poem her mother heard her speak was about the moon as a lock of witch's hair. End quote. During a nighttime walk on the beach, the moon is linked to fickleness, femininity, and also evokes lunacy, which refers to the author's acceptance of her own weak grasp on sanity. I see her back and reflect it faithfully. The woman, the author herself, in her day-to-day world of realism, has turned her back on what she knows to be the allure of her own fantasy world, and here she asserts that this position is only one half of her mental illness, and that both negative and positive are bound inextricably together. With the word faithfully, she states her own positive support of herself in dealing with this inner conflict. She rewards me with tears and an agitation of the hands. The day-to-day self is neurotic and grieving for that part of her that is depressed and torn between what others can see and what she alone can see with her inner vision. I am important to her. She comes and goes. That part that is both genius and ill, both unique and depraved, is nevertheless the part of Miss Plath's self that she must return to for inspiration and the experience of wholeness. She feels she must be tortured by her own mind, or she will cease to exist altogether. Each morning it is her face that replaces the darkness. Miss Plath wrote almost all her work during this time after arising at dawn in order to write before her children woke. In me she has drowned a young girl, and in me an old woman rises toward her day after day like a terrible fish. The carefree life of girlhood is long past, shattered at 10 by the death of her father, a biologist and bee expert. Thus, naturalistic symbolism plays a heavy part in Plath's work. The concept of getting old, of being forced increasingly into the mold of the mundane or mature woman's world, seems to her to be the only thing left for her in this life. Her fantasy world lies dying, and she fears the unknown in her future. Sylvia Plath was strongly influenced by Yeats and Virginia Woolf. She adored the English people from the time of her childhood, and because she perceived them to be uniquely eccentric. Despite her desire to find her own voice during the earlier period of time in her career, she wrote in the strict forms of traditional poetry, which she would later abandon entirely in her last collection, Ariel. I can understand that so many people find her work to be repetitive. However, I find her poems to be both intimate and accessible, which makes her my favorite poet. And the comments on it were excellent, precise, and thoughtful. Your patience is astounding, and your careful analysis on a graduate school level. Thanks for this effort and moving treatment of Plath and her work, which meant a lot to me. Thank you so much for tuning in here with me, and I hope that you have enjoyed this reading. I wish you many, many blessings. Take care.